starting the recording now, and you're supposed to either accept or reject the recording. I will upload the video on our narrative medicine webpage at University of Southern Denmark afterwards. So you can see it or share it if you have colleagues that could not attend the online meeting today. My name is Anders Juhl Rasmussen. I am Associate Professor of Narrative Medicine at University of Southern Denmark, and it's an honor and a pleasure to host this book launch of two new remarkable books in the field of medical humanities. A book by Arthur Frank called King Lear, Shakespeare's Dark Consolations, and a book by Anita Wohlmann called Illness Writing, Metaphor and Illness Writing, Fight and Battle Reused. Sorry, Anita. The structure of these coming 2 hours is that Arthur will begin with a short presentation of form and content in his new book, and then I will try to ask him a few questions, and afterwards you can all ask him questions. I will be moderating the open discussion, and I will recommend that you use an X in the chat if you have a question, and then I'll give you the word. And for Rita Felsky, who cannot use her microphone right now, please write your question, Rita, in the chat, and I'll read it aloud. And then we will move on after the first 60 minutes to Anita, who also has the opportunity to present her new book, and I'll ask her a few questions, and you'll again have the opportunity to question her or give your feedback to her work. So this is the plan. I read from the book cover. Arthur W. Frank received his doctorate in sociology from Yale in 1975 and spent his career teaching at University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. After his retirement in 2013, he taught in Norway, and throughout his career, he has lectured internationally and held visiting professorships in Australia, England, and Japan. His work has focused on experience of serious illness, beginning with his memoir At the Will of the Body, and his most cited work, The Wounded Storyteller. His most recent book was Letting Stories Breathe from 2010. What was not mentioned here on the book cover is that you have a bachelor degree in English from Princeton in 1968. Mm-hmm. You can find more on the webpage arthurwfrank.wordpress.com. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anders, for organizing this. I'm so grateful to you and the University of Southern Denmark. I'm also so happy to be sharing this occasion with Anita, who's been a friend for an increasing number of years now. The years go by faster, and it's wonderful to see older friends and newer friends among the participants. Thank you all for joining us here. The sun is just rising over the Rocky Mountains, but I appreciate for a lot of you it's later in the day. I also want to thank Philip Davis, who invited me to be one of the first authors in this new series from Oxford called My Reading. And it's important to contextualize this book within the My Reading series, where the remit that Philip and Oxford gave us as authors was to take either an author or a single work, in my case, because it's such a massive single work, and talk about it in terms that are distinctly personal. One of the things that drew me to King Lear is that, of course, it's a play about an old man and relationships between generations. And right now in my life, one of the big issues is the role I have in the care of my father and his household. My father will turn 103 in a week, which makes King Lear seem like a youngster. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. Rather than talk about the book, I really would rather let the book speak for itself and read you, please, several passages from different places. This is at the beginning of the book when I'm describing the approach that I take, which I call vulnerable reading. And I've been writing very briefly about my earlier work in At the Will of the Body and The Wounded Storyteller on illness experience. In the work of those decades, I tried to be a witness, not only to people's sufferings with illness, but also to their struggles, to tell their own stories. That struggle is what my title, The Wounded Storyteller, calls attention to. But I neglected what my experience taught me, that our human need to tell our own stories has a complementary need for stories that are not ours. This book explores that need. The figure whom I call the vulnerable reader is another side of the wounded storyteller. To be one requires being the other. Vulnerable reading is how we read when some it threatens who we are committed to believing we are. It threatens the life we want to be able to continue to live. That threat may be immediate or in the future, obvious or vaguely sensed. Vulnerable is one of several words that I lean on heavily, including consolation, suffering, differences, and transcendence. For the scope I want these words to have, each is better imagined than defined. To feel what I mean by vulnerability, I'll venture a Shakespearean metaphor. In one of King Lear's most memorable scenes, the Earl of Gloucester has struggled to get to a cliff, intending to end his life by jumping. Vulnerability is finding ourselves suddenly placed on the edge of such a cliff, fearing what might push us over the edge. The bank we stand on could crumble. A gust of wind might throw us off balance, or prolonged dizziness might overcome us. Our fear is compounded by wondering whether we are desperate enough to jump. Stories cannot and should not make these fears go away. The fears are realistic and useful for our survival. Stories can help us find a way to continue to stand on that edge and feel not secure, but all right. All right, not in the sense that it's a place we want to be, but in the assurance that it's a fully human place to be. Others have been here before. Being here is our participation in a story we are part of, a story that was as unchosen for those who lived it in the past as it is for us now. Vulnerable reading is reading on the edge of a cliff, whatever has brought us there. In vulnerable reading, we seek a companion that can steady us, make our footing more firm, and then continue to be with us to turn to, confident it will offer assurance. But, and this qualification is crucial, companionship takes work on both sides. Stories require that we make ourselves entitled to them. This book is my attempt to make myself entitled to King Lear. I then, in the subsequent chapters work through the story because I wanted the book to be available to people who hadn't read Shakespeare and didn't know the play. And that was a difficult balance to achieve, trying not to bore people who are all too familiar with the play, while at the same time not lose readers who really don't know the play. In this section, I'm engaging the moment at the beginning of the play when Lear has made the fatal mistake of banishing his faithful daughter, Cordelia. One of his courtiers, Kent, has the courage to object to this, and Lear will banish Kent. "What wouldst thou do, old man?" Kent asked Lear, protesting Cordelia's banishment. Hearing Kent's plea for Lear to stop and reflect is when I first realized what a resonant companion King Lear is to me at this stage in my life. Watching the breakdown between Kent and Lear takes me to the edge that I was on many times with my father. In the years after my mother's death, he made unilateral decisions I believe to be questionable, both for his own best interest and for us, his family. My objections were dismissed, but the consequences fell on me to deal with. "What wouldst thou do, old man?" is the cry of whoever struggles to care for a parent who needs that care, but who makes it difficult for others to enact it. Kent, Cordelia, and especially Edgar are the patron saints of so-called adult children, a euphemism I increasingly resent for its failure to recognize that some of us are elderly ourselves. My father is no Lear. He's never cursed or exiled me. But Lear's rejection of Kent's efforts to save him from himself is a moment in which I see my frustrations. Then I ask myself what else I should be seeing. I resisted realizing that I had the ages wrong. I am far closer to Lear's age. Kent later tells us he's 48, young enough to be my son. Lear's age of 80 plus is within a decade of mine. In my care for my father, I am expected to play Kent's role so often that it's a shock to realize I am more accurately Lear. So now I ask myself, what wouldst thou do, old man? Or more often, I forget to ask those words until after I need them. My reading thus finds itself on both sides of a generational divide. The two generations' love for each other totters on the edge of conflict, sometimes falling over that edge. The third section I want to read is from the last chapter of the book. One thing I try to do in the book is not simply talk about dialogue, which I've done in my previous two books, especially The Renewal of Generosity and Letting Stories Breathe, but rather to try to find a way to write that enacts dialogue, to write in a dialogical form. And so the last chapter of the book is experimental in that I write letters to each of the major characters, of which there are at least a dozen in King Lear, and both thank them and apologize to them. I want to read the letter to Lear's fool, his jester, who's a major character in the play. And I choose that one mostly because it's just sort of a readable length. It's one of the shorter ones. It in turn is dependent on the speech that Lear gives earlier when he and Cordelia are being sent to prison. So I'll just read you a few lines from that speech because then I use it again later. "Come, let's away to prison. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. When thou dost ask me blessing, I'll kneel down and ask of thee forgiveness. So we'll live and pray and sing. and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies and hear poor rogues talk of court news. And we'll talk with them too, who wins and who loses, who's in, who's out, and take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies. To Lear's fool. Everyone deserves a fool, not to be the song and dance man you play at being, but for telling the truth as you do. Among all the characters, I remain least sure who you are. Lear isn't sure either. He alternatively patronizes you, comforts you, depends on you, and even loves you. But to his great loss, he never pays you serious attention. And then Shakespeare seems to forget about you, or does he? For me, your disappearance after the hovel is your last best riddle. What is gone, but still present? My guess is that playing the fool is already your second self, and you can't transform yourself further when that self no longer plays a part in the story. You give everything to playing that part, forget your first self in it, and finally, the performance wears you out. By the time you get to the hovel, little of you seems left to disappear. But you burn brightly. You tell the truth more directly than Cordelia, and you are as faithful as Kent. Your relationship to Lear might be the closest he comes until the reconciliation with Cordelia to showing what deserves to be called affection. And then you are gone, remembered in Lear's last words with the final irony that he may be confusing you with Cordelia. For me, you are better remembered in the lingering melody of your song, though the rain it raineth every day. Your singing is the truest consolation. You proceed from being a jester to become the enigma at the core of King Lear, whether with one foot in another reality when you are present, or remaining a presence in your absence. You remind me how much more there is than I am able to see. I doubt whether Lear realized you were one of God's spies, there in his court all along, but maybe being with you is what turned his mind to that phrase. Thinking of you keeps me watching, knowing you can reappear in multiple guises. It was just the greatest pleasure to be able to write this book. We'll hold it up here. And I'm so grateful to Oxford for having brought it out in a material format that so perfectly realizes the way I imagined it appearing. I hope it's not my last book, but if it is the one that I end up going out on, I'm really pretty good with that. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it back over to you, Anders.
Thank you, Arthur. I'm quite sure this is not your last book. I have had the pleasure of reading the book beforehand, and I have also prepared a few questions for you in order to start a dialogue and a common reflection upon what you have written. Let me first ask you about the method of vulnerable reading, which is not a method, but rather a strategy or whatever you like to call it. My question is that in an earlier presentation of vulnerable reading, you choose to ground your 4 or 5 principles in narrative theory. Why have you chosen to move away from narrative theory, dealing with characters, story world, etc., and towards rather psychology, life story, and emotions?
Well, I don't think I have moved away. I think I'm just doing rather than talking about. I'm actually trying to implement the theory rather than presenting it programmatically. As I get older, I'm more and more uncomfortable and even sort of guilty about the amount of time that I've spent in my career telling various people how they ought to do their work. I'm just I feel really badly about that, and that includes both the positions I've been in lecturing to clinicians about best ways of doing clinical practice, or lecturing to academic colleagues about such things as method. At this point in my life, I want to practice rather than proclaim, and simply present those practices as models that people can adapt however you want to, and do what you want with it. I'm just showing you one way of proceeding, and you can take whatever you want from that. But I'm trying, and I think this is maybe the most direct answer to your question. I'm trying very hard not to be prescriptive anymore at this point in my life. As I say, I feel quite guilty. Now, that was also the structure of the situation you're put in when somebody stands you up at a podium in front of a lecture hall. You pontificate. You do speak in programmatic terms. It's what's expected. But now I want to tell stories and talk about my engagement in those stories, and leave it to others to figure out the programmatic, as you say, theoretical aspects of that.
Then let me ask you another question in the same area. To what extent do you think vulnerable reading is teachable to others when there's no methodology and no theory?
I don't think teaching is the right word. I think modeling is the right word. I don't think it's strictly teachable, but I think you can provide models. And I think often modeling is the first and sincerest, the most intimate, certainly, form of teaching. I've often thought that as a university lecturer, what I said about this or that was a good deal less important than the way in which I simply embodied before the students as I showed up for class each week, what it is to live an intellectual life. And maybe the things I said about myself attempting to live an intellectual life were more important to them than the comments I made about this or that aspect of sociology or whatever I was talking about. I think one of the dangers of the PowerPoint age is that we take ourselves literally out of the picture, whereas what really counts, where the most significant learning takes place, is in presenting models that use this word again, that we embody.
Well, then let's go into the more personalized reading that you're presenting in the book. There is a quote that is very famous, and I try to quote it. Who is it that can tell who I am? And it's Lear who asks this in a moment of desperation. In the acknowledgement in your book, you write, and now I quote you, "To thank my daughters, let me say that we write to leave behind what we believe is a better part of ourselves, that those whom we love most may know us as we want to be known." Yeah. Is that your answer to Leah's question?
Well, I think the answer to Lear's question is in two phases. It's other people who are constantly telling us who we are, And then if we have the great privilege in our lives, and it truly is a privilege to be able to withdraw and engage in writing, we seek to find in that writing a way of telling ourselves who we are. And on a good day, which it isn't always, but on the best days, you read back what you've written, and you see yourself in a new way. That writing is a kind of mystical process for me, in which I, as I say, on the best days, I look back at what I've written and really have no idea how that got itself written. Like who wrote that? But it then tells me something about who I am, but in an unfortunately idealized way, because in real life we can't go back and edit things we've done. We can't say, well, I think I'll take another month and go back through the manuscript again and clean it up. It just happens in real time, and we're responsible for all of the gaffes and bad syntax and poor word choices that we make as we live our lives in very real time, brutally real time.
Okay. I have another question in again in the same line here. You write on page 111, I see my family story reflected in King Lear, and I see the politics of my time reflected there as well. My question is, because that is something that I've been thinking about while reading the book, because you're referring to your family story, but you're not confessing and you're not very explicit about your family story. So how is your family story more reflected in King Lear than in any other of Shakespeare's dramas or in literature as such?
Well, I'm not sure it is. Right now, I'm preparing this series of lectures that I'll give at the University of Ghent in February and March on Measure for Measure. And whichever of Shakespeare's plays we take up, we see ourselves reflected differently in that play. And all I can say is this was the time when I was working on Lear, and now I'm working on Measure for Measure, and I see quite different things as I see myself and the world around me reflected in that play. So that's the great thing about Shakespeare, is that we have all these different reflections, and it depends which one we're looking into. And of course, Shakespeare hardly is the extent of literary choices. You can do vulnerable reading with whatever you like. And I hope people will, and show its different parameters as they take it up with very different texts. But for me, the other thing your question raises is this ethical question of how far we can or should tell stories that implicate other people. I actually just had the experience. I was visiting my father throughout October, and I read him this book. And I was wondering what his reaction would be to various passages, including the one I read you earlier. Unfortunately, he's gotten to a stage where he has a really difficult time with the idea that I wrote the book. He treats it as a book that I'm reading him, and he'll talk about, well, what's the author trying to get at? And I'll say, well, Dad, I actually am the author. And he kind of goes, oh, you really, yeah. But I don't think he's able to see himself as a character in the story, which is just fine. You know, I didn't expect him to still be alive now when the book was published. But I think what you're identifying, the other point is there's a whole genre of books now of sort of literary bibliography. I think of Rebecca Mead, My Life in Middlemarch, and there's a whole shelf of other books that people have written about understanding their lives through a single literary work or a collection of literary works. And basically people have two criticisms of each of those books. Either there's too much about the author or there's too much about the book. and trying to strike a happy medium. Again, the passages where I talk about myself and my family are meant to be suggestive. This is not a memoir. It's not a bibliomemoir. I'm simply suggesting to readers connections that they may make, and the connections readers make to King Lear are much more important than anything that I could say about my relationship to the book. I described the book at one point as a handbook, and what counts at the end of it is not whether I've convinced you anything about King Lear. It's whether I've shown you a way of not just reading, but relating to and finding yourself within whatever engages you. You know, whatever books you do, and that's where I share with Philip Davis this interest in reading, and what Philip called in the title of his book, "Reading for Life." That's really the core of it.
I think you succeeded with that ambition. My final question is follow up on actually your answer here. On page 113, you write, King Lear is not a self-help book, and vulnerable reading should resist a tendency to push it in that direction. So my question to you is, because you also use frequently the metaphor of companionship, which could be borrowed from Wayne Booth, The Companion We Keep, with the subtitle, "An Ethics of Fiction." My question is, why do you think it's so important today to legitimize reading as helpful in a therapeutic sense of the word?
Yeah, a broadly generic therapeutic sense. Because I think we live in distinctly troubled times. I came of age in the United States during the Vietnam War. And I think one reason I moved into a career in bioethics is that at a comparatively young age, I and my friends were having very serious conversations about what we were going to do about our participation or resistance to the war. And these were the highest stakes conversations. Our lives depended on it. That was my introduction to ethics, was as a compelling need in my own life to make decisions about this. But despite that, I think the times that we're living in now are actually darker. I think the rise of fascistic movements around the world is truly terrifying to me. You referred earlier to my saying family and political. I just had finished one draft and I was starting another draft on January 6th when I watched on television the insurrection at the US Capitol. And I thought then of Albany's line about the gourd state at the end of King Lear. All of a sudden, King Lear, as I say in the book, seemed to be a witness to the goring of the American state that was there on my television screen on January 6th. It spoke very directly to how quickly a state can fall apart, to abuses of power, to the decline into inhumanity. We totter very much on the edge of that today. And I think more than at any point in my life, we need literature, not as the object of the kind of theoretical contemplation that it became in the 80s and 90s, but rather, to use Rita Felsky's term, is something we can use. And Rita may not agree with how I've used it, but it's an attempt to use literature, and I think the only way we're going to get there is by having lots of experiments like this book. Again, experiments that people can variously take from what you find to be of value. Not a prescriptive program, but a model that, just as children take parts of their parents' behavior that they pick up or reject, that's what a model is. So that speaks, so far as I can right now, to a really big question that you're asking. And in future writing, I'll go on experimenting and finding different answers. And that's exactly how it should be.
Thank you so much. That was the question for me, and now I open the space for anyone in this virtual room. As suggested initially, you could mark with an X in the chat, and then I'll give you the word, and you can turn on your microphone and phrase your question directly to author. You could also write a question in the chat and let me read it aloud, but I prefer that you address your question directly. So, well, Anita, you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Art, for giving us this insight into your newest book. I was very interested in how you defined or imagined vulnerable reading. And you used this idea of, this metaphor, of reading on the edge of a cliff. And you also then mentioned that, of course, we can go over the cliff, right? We can fall off of that cliff. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the risks of vulnerable reading, or maybe even the dangers of engaging in that endeavor.
Yeah, I was encouraged by the editors to overcome my insecurity and resist quoting very many secondary sources to support what I was saying. So the rather few quotations of literary scholars and so on in the book are voices that I truly wanted to engage. And one of these is the Oxford Shakespearean Emma Smith, who's writing I find very useful. She talks about the risk of narcissism in this kind of reading, that when we look too much for our own contemporary concerns in a work of literature, that can become narcissistic. And that's something I engaged throughout the book. My response to that, which people may find more or less satisfactory, is how do we learn to allow characters, or perhaps enable characters, to talk back to us? How do we get beyond identification in the sense of my simply projecting what I need onto a character, and allow the character to speak back? And one of the reasons for writing the last chapter, as I did, in the form of these letters, is that letters are written in anticipation of a response. A letter ends with, in effect, a question mark of, how are you going to respond to this? And I meant the ending of the letter to Lear's Fool quite seriously. How do I keep myself looking for this character to reappear, and keep myself listening for when in some guise that character may be saying something to me that takes me out of this narcissistic reflection. Anders earlier was talking about my use of the companion metaphor. It's important to me that companions are not people who we always get along with. They're people who push back on us. I differentiate in the book between a companion and a sidekick. A sidekick, walks a half step behind and does what you ask them to do. A companion calls you to account for things. A companion says, "I'm really not sure you got that right." So how do we treat literary characters in ways that, as I say, enable them to be companions in that more critical sense, and thus help us keep in mind what to me is the biggest risk of vulnerable reading, which is that it become all about me, and me as I am, as opposed to pushing me toward me as I might be.
I see three persons wanting to ask questions: Bernie Carter, Jürgen Peters, and Jana Klosterman. Bernie, would you like to start?
Okay, I'll try and make this coherent because there's a lot of things going off in my head all at the same time that I'm trying to put together and process. Thanks, Art, as always. You've wrecked my head, but I'm grateful for it. I've a couple of things. Just for people that don't know me, I work with children and families, and typically children and families that are in pain or in some form of crisis. I see parents reading books with children where they both seem to get consolation from stories that are not intended to necessarily provide consolation for the sorts of situations the children are in. It can be very typical, ordinary stories where the child is a little bit vulnerable, but that we've seen that speak to that child to give them permission to speak and for the parent to discuss things. So it seems for me that goes beyond your, I'm going to choose this carefully, kind of a semi-solitary reading, because I know you're in dialogue with the characters, where there's kind of something that's more triadic with the between people and the character. And I was trying to see whether or not that's almost like the parents sometimes purposefully selecting a child's favorite book to teach them something, in the same way that you were reaching out to your characters through letters. So I may have got reading vulnerably completely wrong, but does that make any sense?
No, you've got it completely right. And
oh my God, first time.
For people who don't know, actually, one of the very first presentations I did on this line of work was at Bernie's invitation at Edge Hill, for which I'm very grateful. And the project's come a long way since that, an increasing number of years ago. One aspect of the book that your question indicates that I should mention, that this was a lockdown book. I originally started this project wanting to put together reading groups, and we had several reading groups where we went through various Shakespeare plays, and then that all ended with COVID. And the nature of the period in which I wrote the book was one of lockdown, and that's one reason why there's this enclosure between myself and the characters, because that's how it was during that period of COVID. We were by ourselves. But I think the triadic relationship you're getting at is exactly where a dialogical emphasis leads, and it's where, in some ways, the best vulnerable reading might be one person reading to another, whether it's parents reading to children or me reading to my elderly father. And the other thing that you're saying that's so important is that it's not necessarily a book that speaks directly to the trouble or specifically the illness that person is having. And that's where I think this differs from a lot of what counts within this very general term bibliotherapy, is that at least one part of bibliotherapy is choosing texts that are quite specifically directed to what is understood by the professional as being the issue or disease of the person to whom the reading is prescribed. This really isn't like that. What you're suggesting is, what I tried to do decades ago when I was working on the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, which are really, to me, the exemplars of what you're describing, where these put children in the most extraordinary vulnerable situations. You know, they're lost in the forest. They're being attacked by all kinds of creatures, and yet quite young children who would be terrified by other sorts of reading seem to hear the Brothers Grimm stories and be just fine with them. I was just with my grandson who was reading Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book, which for a young adolescent, you know, would be exactly the kind of reading that you're talking about, of a child who's being stalked by this horrific murderer. But it can be an extremely consoling book, and that's the paradox that really lies at the core of this. It's a kind of homeopathic relationship between the trouble in one's life and a reading that would seem to intensify the sense of trouble, but curiously manages to relieve it. And exactly how that works may be a mystery that you and I, Bernie, can only observe. We'll never really be able to explain it, nor do I feel any particular need to explain it. What I feel a need to do is make it more generally available to people. So thank you.
So I have also John Lorna on my list, but I will start with Jürgen Peters.
Yes, hi, hi, Art. Actually, you may already have answered my question in the last few things that you were saying in response to Bernie's question, but I'll ask my question anyway. As you know, I also worked on literature and consolation in a book in which I have a Shakespeare chapter. I don't deal with King Lear. I deal with a number of scenes in Shakespeare's plays where it struck me that when consolation is at the center of a scene, the scene usually revolves around what I call the failure of consolation. And I may have, let's say, missed King Lear in the sense that maybe in his play there is the success of consolation. I don't know about that, but I was wondering, do you have an answer to a question that I couldn't solve? Namely, how is it that we manage to take comfort from representations of failures of comfort and consolation? And is that more or less what you mean by dark consolation?
Oh, Jürgen, again, for those of you who don't know the relationship, Jürgen's going to be my host at the University of Ghent this winter, and I think you've just really helped me advance the program for the lectures that I'm trying to provide, because actually for the failure of consolation, I think Measure for Measure is a much better play than Lear. In Lear, we get full-blown consolation in the reconciliation scene between Cordelia and Lear in Act 4, and then that's snatched away in Act 5. And we have Kent's monumental line, "Is this the promised end?" Well, it's not. The promised end is what happened in Act 4, when consolation succeeds. And then to lose it in Act 5 plunges us into a depth that in 20th century language we would call existential despair. I mean, we're in the kind of despair as described by Kierkegaard and later by Heidegger, this sort of nothingness, and that's Lear's 5 repetitions of nothing, nothing, nothing. And so we get both in King Lear. And the question that I pose at the end, which I don't think any of us can really answer, but the play to me is not supposed to answer it. It's supposed to help us live with it. Is this the promised end? And it so often in life isn't. And how then do we live with that? And one way we do is by the companionship of others who also have to live with unpromised ends. That again doesn't solve it, but it situates it within a longer human story. But I would also say that your book is one reason why in my book, vulnerable reading is so very much about consolation. The work I'm doing now tries to move vulnerable reading to issues beside consolation. It's vulnerable reading is not just looking for consolation in literature, although I'm very happy to have written a book that emphasizes that. That's a big part of it. But it's not the whole of it. But I'm looking at your book right now, and it was always there, emphasizing consolation for me as I was writing this book, and it had that effect.
Jana Klosterman.
Yes, hi, I'm Jana, and Art, it was a real pleasure to hear your talk, particularly since I've recently started in your department or your home department at the University of Calgary. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, and also I've finished a dissertation that undertook a vulnerable reading of my own, engaging with life histories of former care workers and asking what speaking to each person helped me to think about, or orienting to them more as conversation partners. So even framing it as vulnerable reading and your ways of speaking of that as a generous thing to do, or a way to be responsible or accountable, has helped to reframe it from maybe something that's kind of selfish or a bit tacky to be using it as material, or something kind of provocative about it. So I really appreciate that. But I also did wonder, you talked about engaging in vulnerable reading as a way to work out how to live. And I wondered, was there something that you most learned through this particular project, or a way that it most shaped your thinking by engaging with King Lear, or how you, or was there a way you grew through that process?
King Lear stands out for me, perhaps along with Hamlet, as being a play that just has so many great lines. Working on Measure for Measure and then on into the later plays, they just don't have as many great lines that come out of context and speak to us. Whether it's God's spies, or what wouldst thou do, old man, or is this the promised end? I mean, these lines are just monumental. And I think with Lear particularly, having those lines, as the Shakespeare scholar Michael Whitmore said, jump out at me at various points, really informs my life, where I'll be doing something and one of these lines is just there. And I wrote the book in a way that emphasizes these lines, and I hope helps the reader go away with them resonating in the reader's consciousness. And that would not be the way I would read, for example, Cymbeline or The Winter's Tale or even The Tempest. I think they just work differently. The other thing with King Lear for me, my reading is perhaps different from a number of scholars, in that I really emphasize the part of Edgar, who's the son of of the Earl of Gloucester, who's the subject of his evil brother's plot, who's proclaimed an outlaw, who adopts this persona as Poor Tom, and who has the most embodied suffering of any of the, well, he and his father, both characters in King Lear. And I think it's really keeping in mind Edgar as a model of a courage to endure and to persevere in that endurance. That's just extremely important to me, but as to exactly how it will be important in my unpredictable future, I really can't say. And that's part of the openness of working in this way, is that we can't say exactly how these things are going to come back to us. We can only accumulate resources. I could have, but I resisted taking T.S. Eliot's line, these fragments I've stored against my ruin, as a sort of epigram for the book. Epigraph. But that's very much what this project is about, is storing up fragments against the time when we need to tell a kind of story that we would otherwise be unprepared to tell. But these fragments then come back and give us the resources. And my work for a long time now, really going back to The Wounded Storyteller, is about how storytelling requires particular resources. Another understanding of vulnerable reading is that it gives us the narrative resources we will need to tell future stories that we can't really anticipate at this point in time. I'm so glad you're at Calgary. We must get together. Thank you.
We have almost reached the end of the first round, but I want to give John Lorna permission to ask the last question.
Thank you very much, Anders, and I'll be brief so we don't encroach too much on Anita's time. I'm John Lorna from London. I haven't been able to put my surname on my Zoom identity, unfortunately. I, like Anders, I've had the privilege of reading the book, and it's magnificent. And one of the things that most struck me was that vulnerable reading is contingent on close reading. And I don't just mean close reading, I mean very, very close reading of a kind that I don't think I've experienced since I was studying literature in Cambridge in the 1960s, when it was still under the influence of people like I.A. Richardson, William Empson. You read for nuance, you read for parallelism, you read for ambiguity, for contradiction. It's sort of quite remarkable. And so I think the question that I want to ask, about both as somebody with a literary background and also as a physician, of how do we sustain that tradition of such close reading that it reaches a level that vulnerable reading is then possible? And I'm aware that so much that passes as close reading these days it may be thematic reading, it may be plot reading, it may be political reading, it may be source reading, but it's not close reading in the way that you seem capable of doing.
Thank you, John. I think it's a wonderful question, in part because it then creates a segue into Anita's book, because right at the beginning of Anita's book, I think she has one of the best descriptions of contemporary close reading that I've found. And I think it's important to distinguish between close reading and reading closely. My reservation about the term close reading is that it carries exactly the baggage you're referring to. It goes back to a project that Terry Eagleton has written a very interesting book about recently, which and Toril Moy also has written about this very well, which was trying to claim a much more democratic form of reading by restricting things quite exclusively to the text itself, and taking out of consideration a lot of other forms of intellectual capital that readers might bring, and saying you have to locate this in the text, which was a really crucial move at the time, but I think it went too far. I think now the issue is both to read closely, but also to let us blur the frame around the work, and thus do what earlier versions of close reading disallowed, which is not only to identify with characters, but do what would have brought utter derision when you and I were undergraduates, which is talk about characters as if they were real people. In my version of vulnerable reading, it's absolutely essential to allow literary characters to become real presences in our lives, and that can get kind of hallucinatory or delusional or whatever, and I'm all right with that. I think those can be really useful hallucinations. Again, if we allow them to talk back to us and to challenge us in various ways. Edgar says to me, "So could you do this? How much are you willing to give up of yourself in order to persevere, on what terms?" That's a question that I think goes beyond close reading, but it definitely begins in close reading. So I hope we're moving to a close reading 2.0 or 3.0. And as I said, that's a really good segue into Anita's book. And it also speaks to what I think can be the contribution, what I hope will be the contribution of what we variously call medical humanities and continental thinking, or more in North America, health humanities, which is able to step across disciplinary boundaries and do things that would be out of bounds within the strict confines of disciplines as they have been. And that's where academic life to me is very useful. Dialectic of movement from the discipline of disciplinarity, which has its value, to then breaking down the boundaries of disciplinarity, which I think is the moment we're in right now, with interests like medical humanities, which brings us back to Anders and our host that's hosting the program today, a medical humanities program. So that's a brief answer to a question that could engage us much further, John. Thank you.
And thank you, Arthur, for this first book presentation and follow-up discussion. I will now unpin you and pin Anita, if that's okay, because Anita has written the second book that we are now going to discuss. And before I let you present your work, Anita, you are now pinned. I will give you a brief introduction. Anita Wohlmann is Associate Professor in Contemporary Anglophone Literature at University of Southern Denmark, Odense, where she is a member of the Center for Uses of Literature. Anita's research focuses on the usability of literary text and concepts in contexts such as medicine, healthcare, and age studies. She has a particular interest in metaphor, illness, narratives, and serial narration. Anita is a founding member and coordinator of the German Network for Narrative Medicine. In 2021, she co-edited an anthology on Narrative Medizin, Praxisbeispiele aus dem deutschsprachigen Raum, Narrative Medicine Examples from German-speaking Contexts. And her newest monograph is, as said before, Metaphor and Illness Writing, Battle and Fight Reused, and it is published at Edinburgh University Press. Please give us your presentation, Anita.
Thank you so much, Anas. And also thank you so much for providing this opportunity for Art and myself to present our work to this wonderful audience. This is really a wonderful opportunity. Yeah, I'm very excited to share with you some of the ideas that I present in my book. This book started as many books do in a quite different fashion and form. I started thinking about metaphors in around 2014, and back then it was a project on the female body and how it's represented in 19th century American fiction writing by women authors. And I was very much interested in the way that they use metaphors of the female body to negotiate scientific researches that try to define what the female body is capable of doing or not doing. And this project was then funded by the German Research Foundation, for which I was extremely grateful. But then it evolved and merged into quite a different project. I stayed with this idea of metaphors, but I moved to one very specific metaphor, namely the idea of battle and fight in the context of illness, and in particularly in the context of illness narratives. And I moved from this kind of historical angle to a very contemporary focus on contemporary autobiographical and semi-autobiographical writing. And much of this change has to do actually with my start in this wonderful research group called Uses of Literature, which I joined in 2017 and which has been really instrumental and very inspiring for my research. And this program was very generously sponsored and funded by the Danish National Research Foundation, and has ended last year with a big closing conference, and we're continuing the center actually with the help of Peter and Emily. So there's more to come, I hope, from this scholarly background. I mentioned this research project because, as I said, it has been so influential for my thinking about metaphors. And Rita Felsky's work has been a huge impact on the way that I started to think and rethink my approach to metaphors and what they can do. And Rita has written lots and lots of books, but two of them have been particularly influential for me. The one is, of course, or the first one is this book titled Uses of Literature, where she discusses in very convincing ways to me the varied usability and often the very unpredictable uses of literature for readers. And the second book that doesn't seem to have an obvious reference to usability is her publication called The Literature After Feminism, which talks about actually quite a different subject matter. But I stumbled across a couple of sections in this book that I found really inspiring. Because among others, Rita talks about acts of creative revision that many of the female authors that she studies are engaging with. And she lists some of these strategies and calls them embellishing, rearranging, modifying, supplementing, expanding, tinkering, and so on and so forth. And these strategies of reusing, recycling, adapting, playfully misusing something like literature, or in my case, metaphors, has been something that has been, or is very foundational to my book project. In my presentation, I want to focus on two types of uses. The first one are the metaphor uses that I try to describe in the book through numerous close readings. And the second part will be devoted to my attempt to use the findings of my book in teaching. So in my book, I look at a number of different North American writers. Among them is Arthur Frank as well. I look at these texts and these writers, and I'm interested in the ways that they work with metaphors, of course. Now, what brings these different authors together is actually that they share surprisingly much. First of all of them are very accomplished writers, and all of them became ill or have been ill for a long time. And the illnesses are quite distinct, or it's quite diverse. So it's cancer, it's migraine, and it's depression. And all of these writers wrote about their own experiences, most of them in the genre of essays or autobiographies. And Wallace, to some degree, is a different case here because his text is actually, I would call it semi-fictional. And what's interesting about all of these texts is that all of them use one particular metaphor to describe what it feels or is like to live with illness. And they use the fight metaphor, which is maybe the most conventional, but certainly the most frequently used metaphor to speak about illness. What all of these authors share as well is that they are very, very critical of this metaphor. And yet all of them continue to use that metaphor. And they do that in very creative forms of reuse. So just to revisit very, very briefly, what is actually at stake with this battle or fight metaphor, and why is it often criticized? The problems that are often quoted when we think about battle or fight in the context of illness is that very often it seems to justify brutality and extreme measures in treating the ill human body. It also continues a problematic body-mind duality, which allows us then to consider the body as a kind of enemy against which we have to fight. It also suggests that there's only one desirable outcome of this fight, and that is victory. And it also associates losing the fight or capitulating with failure and humiliation. However, there are also a lot of mappings that work really well, which is, I guess, one of the reasons why we continue to use this idea of fighting against illness. And Arthur Frank actually says in his autobiography that there's something about this metaphor that feels actually really true. Maybe it is because when we are in a very serious illness, we are in a liminal position, similarly to being in a war, for instance. So it is a life and death matter. Also, when we are in a fight or in a war, we are under the command of something else. And then we often associate the scars with battle wounds. And also what I hear again and again and read again and again is that when people use the fight metaphor, it can actually have a very positive effect for them because it can feel empowering. It can give people the courage and the strength to continue to fight. Now, as I said, I'm really interested in looking at strategies of creative reuse. And I want to make clear that I'm not interested in redeeming the metaphor of fight. I'm not trying to kind of convert this metaphor from a harmful one into one that is more beneficial. Rather, I wonder what kind of strategies do these different authors use in order to make a language that is alien or feels alienating into one that is their own, that they take ownership of, and also a type of language that then matches their own experience. So what kind of tinkering, what kind of adaptation or rearrangement is being done so that this notion of fight then matches someone else's experience? And then how can we understand these practices? What kind of work do they do? And what do they afford? So, for example, do these strategies represent a form of resistance, for instance, or a form of agency? Or do they help the writers to thicken their experience? And maybe, could it be that engaging with the metaphor in this kind of intense way, could that also be an enjoyable experience? And I would like to focus on one chapter a little bit more to illustrate how these different aspects of a creative reuse of the metaphor can look like. And I would like to focus on the second chapter on Susan Sontag, because in a book on illness metaphors, there's really no way around Susan Sontag. Instead of quoting from kind of the very typical and well-known quotations from her essays, I want to direct your attention to actually the ending of her second essay, where she describes actually a way of how she imagines a way of dealing with metaphors that I felt was very close to this idea of reusing a metaphor. Because what Susan Sontag suggests at the end of AIDS and its Metaphors is that metaphors cannot be distanced just by abstaining from them. They have to be exposed, criticized, belabored, used up. And I found this idea of belaboring a metaphor very, very interesting and inspiring. And I was wondering, what is it actually that she means by this? And how could a belaboring look like? And I realized that in her own essays, she already belabored metaphors quite a lot. She is tracing them throughout history, throughout all kinds of contexts. She compares how different metaphors work for different illnesses. And she engages in all kinds of other belaboring strategies. But in addition to looking more closely at her essays, I became more and more interested in finding out how Susan Sontag was thinking about metaphors in other places of her writing. And I started to read her diary entries, which were posthumously published by her son, David Reeve. And what I noticed is that Susan Sontag also used this idea of battle and fight on a very different level, actually, because she described herself, for instance, in one of her diary entries as an adversary writer, as someone who likes to attack other people's ideas, who loves to engage in this kind of defense of her own ideas, and who considers this type of intellectual battle as one that is deeply enjoyable for her, and also one that for her is a sign of high quality. And it's no wonder, therefore, that she actually chose the form of the essay, especially this kind of polemical essay style that she uses also for her two metaphor essays or writings, because of course the essay allowed her to be very argumentative. And as I just showcased, basically, we can think of arguments as a form of fighting, right? And this is actually one metaphor that we use quite often, as I just illustrated. We fight against ideas, we attack ideas, we defend them, and so on. So this notion of using fight was actually one that was very, very close to Susan Sontag, an idea that she really liked. And that came easy to her. But she was also increasingly doubtful about choosing the essay style, for instance, and this kind of adversary position. And that is also something that she describes more in her autobiographical texts, because what she finds difficult about the essay form is that it becomes, as she says, a demagogic activity. And it seems, she says, as if she was the bearer of certainties that she actually did not possess. So increasingly, Susan Sontag was then abandoning the essay form and was trying other styles, other forms in order to explore her ideas. And when I read David Reeve's memoir about his mother and how she dealt with her illnesses, so the 3 bouts of cancer that she had, I was very struck by the different ways in which David Reeve actually described his mother's way of dealing with her illness. And David Reeve argued that his mother really fought until the bitter end, and that she was very much inspired also by triumph narratives of successful cancer battlers, such as Lance Armstrong, for instance. And he argues that Susan Sontag deeply believed in the progress narrative of scientific research that is informed by the notion of conquest, of victory, and exceptionalism. But David Reeve also brings to our attention the following quote from Susan Sontag. He read in one of her diaries that are not yet published the following quote, where Susan Sontag says, "I feel like the Vietnam War, my body is invasive, colonizing, they're using chemical weapons on me, and I have to cheer." And in Reeve's memoir, it becomes clear that his mother was, on the one hand, fighting really, really strongly, but often she also felt very depleted and decimated and exhausted and not in a fighting mood at all. And what I found really interesting in David Reeve's contemplation about these kind of controversial ways of how Susan Sontag fought or did not fight was that he argues that this kind of fighting spirit and fighting mode was the way that she wanted to remember her illness experiences. And that's how she wanted to remember herself as a strong woman, as a strong fighter, because that was for her a very empowering way, a very liberating and nourishing way of dealing with that illness experience. And that made me think about the temporal aspect also of what it means to use and reuse a metaphor over time. Because as Susan Sontag examples show, we use metaphors all the time, but they can also change their meaning depending on the situation that we are in. So they're not these kind of stable forms, but they are malleable and can be adapted to all kinds of situations. So in my book, I describe several strategies of reuse that can have actually multiple affordances. So they can be empowering, they can be a form of agency, they can be a form of resistance, as for instance, for Audre Lorde. They can lead to a kind of thickening of experience, as I said earlier, and also intensify particular emotions, for instance, or experiences. And they can be very nourishing and actually also gratifying. And maybe what I take as a kind of link between all of the close readings that I do is that this idea of fight, this kind of concept of fighting occurs on so many different levels. It's something that is being discussed on the thematic level, but it's also very often linked to a kind of aesthetic or stylistic choice. So this essay form, for instance, as in the case of Susan Sontag, this kind of polemical style of writing that she engages with, her self-conceptualization as an adversary writer, these kind of aesthetic elements can also be found in other writers' texts. And then it's often also associated with a kind of habit of mind that is being negotiated. And then, of course, we can trace different kinds of practices of how the fight metaphor is being used and reused through aesthetic choices, for instance. And I would like to come now to the second part. And I don't know how much time I've left, probably not too much, but this part is shorter than the first one. And what I'd like to go into now is to tell you about the last chapter. So the previous chapters are very typical literary analyses. They're close readings of texts, very fine-grained analyses of these texts and the literary devices that the writers employ. And the last chapter of my book asks a maybe idealistic question, namely, can we translate these writers' strategies into other contexts? And that last chapter is also informed, of course, by my work in narrative medicine. So I often work with healthcare professionals, and I often have talked to them about how important metaphors are in their work. And then often they ask me, yeah, so what? What can we do, right, about that? So in that last chapter, I propose something that I call a metaphor method. And behind that name is actually something that to many literary scholars would be completely, it's a banal thing, basically, because it's something very basic, something that we all know and have learned in our studies, namely how to analyze a metaphor. So I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. In fact, this is pretty unoriginal in that sense. And in fact, I submitted that last chapter to a journal and it was rejected. And one of the reviewers said, this is completely unoriginal. We cannot publish this. And I have to agree, it is unoriginal in many ways. But what the reviewer did not get is that it doesn't try to be original. So it is not original, but I think it still has quite a lot of value. Because what I think is relevant, or what I realized more and more as I was teaching in narrative medicine context, is that we need something that is easy to understand and offers some kind of step-by-step procedure. What I was trying to do is really to break down metaphor analysis into 4 simple steps. And I add a 5th step that offers basically condensation of the strategies of rethinking metaphors that I traced in my close readings. And I think that this chapter can be quite useful because it illustrates each step with examples from healthcare practice. And I also think that this chapter does fill a gap in the research so far, because there are a lot of studies on metaphor in healthcare. And many of these studies say that metaphors are super important for communication, and they also recommend that we should be more attentive towards metaphors and the kind of work that they do. They also say that we should use these metaphors in order to create a common language with patients, for example. But all of these studies and their recommendations often end there. So there is a level of vagueness in these studies that I thought I could address. And the other kind of problem, or maybe gap, that I saw is that very often the definitions of metaphor are very, very broad, or the understanding of metaphor is very broad, in the sense that everything that is not meant literally, but figuratively, is defined as a metaphor. But in metaphor analysis, actually, something like a symbol, for instance, would not count as a metaphor. It is figurative, a symbol, but it's not a metaphor. It functions actually quite differently. So what I'm trying to offer here is, a method that is really geared towards metaphor and towards trying to understand them, trying to work with them with 5 easy steps. And my latest addition to this project on metaphor is a vademecum that I made. It's basically a small postcard that I designed. It's maybe a bit more of a playful approach to that whole book. It's an attempt to revive this kind of old-fashioned idea of a vademecum, which used to be kind of a small portable book that you could put into your trousers or into your coat, for instance. And of course, it's completely out of date in a way, or outdated, I mean, or old-fashioned, in the sense that today, of course, this kind of information comes through apps on our mobile phones. But still, I thought this could be maybe a charming idea. I haven't used this vademecum yet, but I plan to do so in future when I do workshops on metaphor. If you are interested in this little thing here, or would like to know more about my book, then please use this link here. I will also post it later into our chat, and you will find actually a longer version of this metaphor method online, and you can download it. You also find 2 open access chapters from my book, the introduction and this a metaphor method chapter. And then there's also a podcast that I made very recently with the help of a wonderful interviewer from the New Book Network who wanted to be here today. I'm not sure if she is, Victoria Lupashko. Thank you so much for asking me to speak about my book. So if you want to listen to that podcast, it's about an hour long. You'll find the link on my website. And then, of course, there's a link also to my publisher's website. And I believe the discount of 30% is still active. So that could be another option to learn more about this topic. Lastly, and this is really my last slide now, I want to extend a big thank you to everyone who was involved in making this book into what it is today. Primarily, of course, my wonderful colleagues from the Uses of Literature Research Group. So many of you are here today. So thank you so much for listening to endless presentations of half-baked ideas, giving wonderful feedback on individual chapters. For instance, Emily, Irlin, Peter read entire chapters. Also, Arthur read a chapter. Danielle Spencer, whom I've seen is also around, read a chapter. Thank you so much for helping me shape my ideas into this book. And I also want to thank particularly Rita Felsky, who has just been amazing, and Marie Mai, Peter Simonsen, likewise. They created such a wonderful and generous atmosphere in this research group. They have been supportive in a way that yeah, it's just a dream, I really have to say. And they've created this wonderful, supportive and warm-hearted atmosphere that was inspiring. They also gave me a job, which is just as important, I guess. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank very briefly Horatio Salinas, who allowed me to use that wonderful photograph at the cover of this book without any fee, just amazing. And my apologies to anyone that I should thank, but haven't thanked and can't think of right now. Thank you so much to everyone who's still around, and I'm very happy to take questions now.
Thank you, Anita, for a rich presentation. A little bit longer than 15 minutes.
Sorry.
But we still have time left for questions. I will restrict myself to only 2 questions, and then we'll open the space for everyone. The first question is about how you locate your research. You locate it in the fields of medical humanities and narrative medicine. And that makes me wonder how you define narrative medicine. Wouldn't it be enough perhaps to locate it in the field of medical humanities? Because as I read your book, it's comparable to, for example, angioretic illness as narrative. And, you know, there's no clinical side of the research. So why do you want to also put it in the field of narrative medicine?
Oh yes, definitions of fields, right? That's really challenging. For me, very personally, medical humanities and health humanities are very broad fields. Maybe they're kind of the broader tent under which narrative medicine also features. And the way that I think of narrative medicine is a field that is very, very interested in bridging somehow the divide between humanities and medical practice. And maybe one could say that the first 5 chapters of the book are medical humanities inspired chapters. And then the last one tries to offer something that is maybe more in the kind of narrative medicine spirit.
Yeah, perhaps. My second question would be also a broad one, addressing the close reading. You describe your method as close reading, and I have no queries about that. That is definitely close reading. My wonder is, why did you choose close reading? Because as a literary scholar working with Rita Felsky in the Use of Literature project, there are so many other alternatives to this a little bit old-fashioned, dry, neutral, distanced, unpersonal way of reading literature. Why were you not attracted more by new reader theory, reader affects, emotions? Why do you stick to the tradition, the old tradition of close reading?
I think that for literary scholars, close reading is what we typically do. It's kind of the starting point, like this close attention to a text and what the text does. And then we can link it with other approaches, right? With more reader focused approaches, for instance, or with more contextual information, for instance, right? And for me, and what I was trying to do was really to stay very, very close to one metaphor, right? To not keep it, like lose it from sight, right? And then to see what does one particular metaphor do in its immediate context, right? And how does a particular context shape the metaphor in different ways, right? How does irony, for instance, or a changing narrative perspective, for instance, change what the metaphor can do? And so for me, for the project that I had in mind, close reading was really the only option, to be honest. I couldn't think of another method that would have been as logical for me than close reading, to be honest.
Okay, so now it's open for everyone to ask questions for Anita. And again, put an X in the chat, and I'll try to keep, you know, the Olympic eye of a speaker list. John Lorna, will you start?
I will indeed, Anders, but it's more of a response to your questions or challenges to Anita than putting further questions to Anita, which is to say, as somebody who teaches narrative medicine and who works constantly with physicians, including physicians in oncology and palliative care, I can't imagine a form of teaching narrative medicine that it didn't include or wasn't centered around sensitivity to metaphors and their complexity and what they convey, which, I mean, whether you want to call it close reading or not, it certainly depends on very close attentiveness, which is both a cognitive attentiveness to the nature of the words being uttered, but also an emotional attentiveness as well. That what are the feelings behind those words? What are the feelings that led to the choice of those words? I mean, I've read some of Anita's chapters, which I would suggest very closely support that view and indeed strengthen it or thicken it, as she might say. So, as I say, that's more of a comment than a question, but I'd be very happy for Anita to add anything that she wants to kind of my commentary on her commentary on your commentary.
No, thank you so much for this. This is beautifully put, and I couldn't have said this better. Thank you.
Okay, Peter Simonsen.
I can't hear you.
Oh, I need to unmute. Sorry. Thank you, Arthur Frank. Thank you so much, Anita, both for the wonderful presentation and the kind words. This will be maybe a ritualistic question that I feel compelled to ask, and maybe I don't know the answer. Moving from literary close reading into your vademecum, or your sort of how to analyze metaphor, that's the kind of thing that we have been trained to be hesitant to provide to our students when we teach them close reading. So no, there is no checklist on how to analyze, shall I compare thee to whatever? But are you going to take the vademecum into our literature classes? Or is that where we're headed, where our experience in teaching clinicians close reading, that we can bring something back to literary studies to maybe take it into what Arthur Frank calls maybe the close reading 3.1? Or do you see any dangers in this kind of maybe programmatic metaphor analysis? If I don't know if that's a question, but will it change literary studies? What your next book, as it were?
I think right now I can only speak for what this work did for myself, and also what engaging with narrative medicine and with medical students did for my own work in literary studies, right? And that is an increased need to articulate very clearly what it is that we're actually doing. And yet to have a better vocabulary actually for what it is that we're doing, without, however, becoming prescriptive, right? So I don't want this little thing here to be understood as a guide, like a how-to, right? This is how you have to do it in order to fully understand a metaphor, right? In fact, what I say is that these steps, I mean, there are 5 steps, right? But they can be used like interchangeably, right? There's no like fixed order to this, right? And it's kind of like a reiteration. The way that I understand it is more of a way of focusing our attention to particular aspects of what metaphors can do, right? It kind of making this is clearer, the vision in a sense, right? That it's not just, oh yeah, vaguely this is a metaphor and I feel this and this about it, but to really be able to say, okay, a metaphor has a source and a target domain, right? Things move between these sources and the target, the source and the target. What is it exactly that moves, right? How can we evaluate that? Just to kind of give kind of maybe, yeah, a language again, right? To how we can think about, how we can speak about metaphor. And I think that as soon as we have the kind of language to speak about it, it will automatically increase our attention, right? Our awareness of metaphor. Because this is the wonderful thing that language does. As soon as you have the language to talk about something, it becomes yeah, your attention, your awareness is there, right? And you can work with it in much more competent ways. So this is kind of a long-winded answer to your question. But yeah, this is how I think about it. And maybe I'll bring it into a literature studies classroom, who knows? I'll be teaching poetry next week. So maybe that's useful for students. I don't know if they need it actually. But yeah, I think it's maybe it's something to think about of how it might change also our teaching in the literary studies classroom. Yeah.
I see Jana Klosterman and Yvonne Buchheim on the list. So first, Jana.
Yeah, even seeing the table of contents was just so striking with such juicy titles, and I really appreciated the effort to even teach people form or that method. And I'll certainly look forward to teaching that in sociology of health courses. And as you said, even if it's just one way to go through that process of learning a close reading, it's really helpful to see the steps. My question, I wondered more about the relationship between close reading or perhaps even vulnerable reading and that creative revision. And I also wondered, with the authors you looked at, did you see them as undertaking kind of a vulnerable reading, or that to be able to even write a memoir, you need to be attending to context in a certain way, or reflecting on your own stakes or own implication, or in what ways is kind of that central to any kind of artistic offer or move? I just wondered with how that goes together, or if you could say more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Jana. I immediately have to think about Audre Lorde and her writing, and this idea of vulnerable reading to me also brings up the question of temporality, and that would have been a question that I would also have asked Arthur, actually. Kind of, how does vulnerability relate to when you write about a book, about an experience, or when you read about an experience, right? And for me, Audre Lorde, I mean, she wrote 2 books, or like 2, I study 2 works in this chapter. The first one is, of course, at Cancer Journals, which exposes some kind of vulnerability, but there's so much power and anger and activism kind of blended into that. And then there is another publication called The Burst of Light, I believe. Sorry, I think it's the Burst of Light. I have to look it up again. Sorry. And there she writes about her liver cancer experience, and there is a lot of like anger in those diary entries as well. But there's a different level of vulnerability, I feel. Maybe it was because she knew that she was closer to death, and she actually died without being able to kind of finish that, and was published posthumously, as far as I remember. A Burst of Light. Thank you so much, Danielle. So I think there are different degrees of vulnerability in both of these texts, and I would love to return to that, actually, with this idea of vulnerability and reading your own work also vulnerably. Could be super interesting to look into that. Thank you, Jana.
Yeah, thank you. Beautifully put.
Yvonne?
So thank you very much, Anita, and also Art. I found both your presentations very insightful. I would like to comment, and in some ways also maybe connect the 2 presentations. So I'll start with you, Anita, and then hopefully we'll, bring it also together. I think the question that came to me when I saw your presentation was that actually on the side you also had illustrations, And it made me think in which way you've chosen those illustrations, and how moving from the written format into a visual format has kind of informed your thinking about the metaphor. And I think when we think about language, it goes a step further, because you clearly, as someone who works in different languages, who speaks English, has a German mother tongue, lives in Denmark. So this idea that different countries, different languages have different metaphors, and sometimes, and I find that myself as well as a native German speaker, that you take one metaphor and you translate it into English. Only as you speak it, you realize, oh, this is the wrong one, because in English we're using this and this different image idea, you know. So yeah, I really wondered about the use of language and the visual language, how this kind of informed your thinking. And I think where I'll keep going, because then and then the other or connected thought to that is actually art talking about experimentation and going off script. And I think, Anita, you also somehow talked, if I understand you correctly, talked about this when it comes to teaching. So, and I think this is where my question sort of comes in, and I haven't really clearly got it yet, but it's something about how can you bring experimentation, going off script, maybe even the risk of failure into teaching by maybe making metaphors like to topple them, you know, to maybe even to go from one form into another and let them fail. And I don't really know. I think this is also my question to you, is like, where does that kind of that making strange, I would call it, and that comes from art, from visual art, estrangement, making strange. How does making strange can work in the way that you teach the uses of metaphor? And yeah, I think for art, it's more within this adapt, you know, taking and responding to characters so that they come alive. But it's a similar question, you know, where does that to elaborate on the experimentation factor? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's such a wonderful question, and so rich, and could go into so many directions. And I think I want to focus on the last part of what you said about this idea of experimentation, because of course that is at the heart of ideally every fresh metaphor, right? That it brings two things together that haven't been brought together before, and all of a sudden you have this kind of surprise moment, and you see something in a new way that you didn't see it before, right? I chose to focus on one of the most frequently used metaphors, extremely conventional metaphor, very kind of worn out metaphor, the fight idea, where this whole idea of surprise is no longer there, right? Because it has become so internalized. And what I find very interesting, especially actually in my work, in my workshops with clinicians, for instance, is when we think about such metaphors, and then I ask them to imagine something new, right? To basically rework a metaphor, to reuse it in creative and imaginative ways. And it's fascinating what they come up with, right? There are all of a sudden a metaphor springs up really from a very, very conventional one. So for instance, I'm often working with a metaphor that comes from clinical practice, where a patient says, I want to be the captain of my own ship, right? And then we kind of go through the steps and we analyze it, we think about what does it mean, and so on and so forth. And then I've asked repeatedly my participants to kind of reimagine that ship idea. And they come up with the most amazing examples, right, of what kind of ships they imagine. Someone was thinking about Star Trek, for instance, right? And all of a sudden they talked about that kind of, yeah, sorry, I'm really tired now. Raumschiff, in German we say Raumschiff, spaceship. Yeah, of course, there we go, right? So the kind of spaceship that they came up with, right? And so this kind of experimental quality that is really at the heart of metaphor can be reanimated and revived through this kind of practice also, I would say. So that would be my kind of very long answer to your question, and it's only answering parts of it. But maybe Art has something else to add to that comment.
I will add that we have only 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
But please take those last 2 minutes. No? No, okay. But then we will end with your screens split in two. So you two coming together again visually. Thank you so much for your presentations and your willingness to discuss vulnerable reading, narrative medicine, close reading. I think it has been such a joyful last 2 hours, and I also see that participants has not been bored, because the number of participants are quite stable, even though that we are getting closer to 6 o'clock and dinner time in Denmark and Europe. Author is just waking up.
Breakfast time here in Calgary.
And
Thank
going
you
for
so much,
breakfast.
Anders. I really thank you for hosting this. You've done such a wonderful job fielding the questions and organizing all of this, and just our true gratitude to you for getting our books so beautifully launched. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. So see you.